She worked double shifts just to keep her sick mother alive. One day, a man walked into her diner with a silent boy and medical tubes, and she did what no one else dared. The next morning, her cruel boss vanished, and a luxury car appeared at her door with a sealed envelope. Inside it was a name she wasn't supposed to know, and an offer that could change everything. Stay with us to see how one act of kindness unlocked a future she never imagined. And don't forget to subscribe. On the snow-covered outskirts of Flagstaff, among pine trees weighed down by frost and rooftops glazed with ice, another bitterly cold morning began to unfold. The air was crisp and dry, and the sky hung low in a pale, silent gray. Inside Pinewood Grill, a modest roadside diner with chrome fixtures and foggy glass windows, Rachel Harper punched in another order on the aging register. Her fingers, stiff from the cold that had settled into the bones of the building overnight, moved with mechanical precision. The register let out a reluctant beep, and she stepped away to retrieve a stack of menus, already beginning to curl at the edges from years of use. The diner buzzed with the clatter of plates and the low murmur of bundled-up travelers. Snow boots stomped against the worn linoleum floor, shaking off melting slush, while a new team of young servers fumbled with their aprons and notepads behind the counter. Steam curled above the coffee pots, and the smell of fried eggs and burnt toast lingered heavily in the air. Behind the scenes, the kitchen was already falling behind, and tempers flared in sharp bursts through the swinging door. Rachel, just past 30, carried the exhaustion of someone who had not had a day off in weeks. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, a few loose strands clinging to her cheeks, flushed from the heat of the kitchen and the cold draft that crept in each time the door swung open. Her eyes, once bright and expressive, had dulled under the weight of long shifts and longer nights, though a trace of old kindness still flickered when she smiled. She hadn't planned this life. Years ago, she had been studying applied psychology at Northern Arizona University, dreaming of working with children facing behavioral challenges. But those plans had unraveled quickly when her father passed away in a sudden accident. With a younger brother still in high school and a mother diagnosed with degenerative arthritis, Rachel had walked out of her program and straight into the workforce. What was supposed to be temporary had become permanent. For months now, she had been working open to close 7 days a week. The owner of the diner, a faceless man with money and no time for small-town matters, visited only occasionally. Day-to-day operations fell to Jerry, a stocky man in his 50s whose leadership style oscillated between laziness and belligerence. He barked orders more than he gave instructions, and Rachel had long since learned to keep her head down and her pace steady. That morning, the tables filled quickly. Tourists stopped by on their way to the Grand Canyon or Sedona, leaving behind muddy footprints and thick coats dripping with melting snow. Rachel weaved between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates and refilling coffee without missing a beat. Then, just past 9, it happened. Near the back corner, she stepped on a slick patch, likely a trail of coffee someone hadn't wiped up, and her foot slipped. The tray in her hands tilted forward, and a bowl of tomato soup flew from its center, hitting the floor with a wet crash. Some of it splashed onto the boots of an older woman seated nearby. For a moment, everything froze. The sound of forks paused midair, and conversations faltered as heads turned. Rachel caught her balance, her heart pounding. Before she could crouch to clean up the mess, Jerry's voice rang out across the diner, sharp and accusatory. He didn't come to help, only stood with crossed arms near the kitchen, eyes narrowed, his tone laced with mockery. The woman with the soup-covered boots looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat, but said nothing. Rachel knelt down, wiped the floor in silence, and gathered the bowl fragments with practiced hands. She returned to the kitchen, her stomach tight. The shame burned beneath her skin, not because of the mistake, those happened, but because she had no power to push back. She needed this job. Her mother's medications cost more than her rent, and her brother was still recovering from a layoff at the auto shop. Letting go wasn't an option. Not yet. Not until she could find a way out. So she kept her head down, wiped her hands, and went back to pouring coffee, her apron still stained with soup. The day had only just begun. By late morning, the flow of customers had shifted from sleepy locals to passing travelers and out-of-town families, their cars parked just outside, steaming in the cold sun. The lunch rush had started earlier than usual, and the small diner was alive with movement, clinking cutlery, overlapping voices, and the low hiss of a struggling grill. Rachel moved between tables with the quiet rhythm of habit, her notepad worn at the corners, her steps precise and unobtrusive. She barely registered the opening bell above the door until she felt the sudden stillness that often followed something unusual. A man stepped in, wearing a worn work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. Snow melted slowly across his shoulders. Slung over one arm was a faded green backpack. Beside him, moving a little slower, was a young boy, no older than 7, his small chest rising and falling in sync with the soft mechanical pulse of a portable breathing machine strapped to him. Thin tubes ran from his nose to the device, and his coat hung loosely from a frame that seemed too fragile for the Arizona winter. They walked with quiet intention to a booth tucked away in the far corner of the diner, near a window framed with frost. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees outside, casting shifting shadows on the scratched linoleum floor. The table they chose was old, the vinyl on the seat cracked and faded, the plastic tablecloth slightly peeling at the corners. But it was quiet there, warm, private. Rachel watched as the boy slid into the booth, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the tabletop. His father sat across from him without speaking, taking the breathing device from his shoulder and placing it gently beside the boy like a familiar ritual. Around them, the atmosphere changed subtly. A few of the younger servers glanced at each other, unsure. Some looked away, others exchanged half smiles of polite refusal. No one approached the table. No one wanted the responsibility. Rachel didn't hesitate. She tucked her notepad into her apron and walked across the room. She approached with soft footsteps and a neutral, professional calm that masked the small ache in her chest. Kneeling slightly beside the booth, she smiled at the boy, taking care not to overwhelm him with eye contact. He remained quiet, his eyes downcast, but she noticed the tension in his small frame ease ever so slightly. She didn't ask questions. She offered warmth, comfort, simplicity. She took their order quietly, noting the names printed on the ticket. The boy's name was Jason. The man, his father, was Matthew. There was something in the man's expression beyond exhaustion. It was the look of someone carrying not just a sick child, but a history of long nights, waiting rooms, and unanswered questions. He barely spoke beyond the essentials, but his eyes held a watchful intensity, as if measuring every word, every gesture, searching for signs of judgment or pity. In the kitchen, Rachel set aside their order, a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup for Jason, a turkey melt and black coffee for Matthew. She pulled a small saucepan off the shelf and quietly warmed a mug of milk, stirring in a spoonful of honey without asking. It was something her mother used to do on cold days, a comfort passed between generations. Before she returned to the table, she glanced around the diner. Jerry, the manager, stood near the coffee machine, watching with a narrowed gaze. His posture said everything: disapproval, irritation, calculation. But Rachel ignored it. She brought the tray over herself. First, she adjusted the boy's seat, folding an extra napkin beneath him so he could reach the table more comfortably. Then she set down the mug of milk without fanfare. She placed the soup gently in front of him and slid the sandwich over with care. The radio in the corner had been playing a classic rock station, but Rachel subtly changed it to a local kids broadcast, a soft voice reading stories in slow, careful tones. As she checked the airflow from the vent above their table, she made sure it wasn't hitting Jason directly. She adjusted the dial slightly, then moved on without lingering. The boy still hadn't spoken, but his breathing had steadied, and for the first time, his eyes briefly met hers before flickering away again. Jerry said nothing, but Rachel could feel the weight of his glare from across the room. It wasn't just disapproval, it was anticipation. As if he was waiting for her to take one step too far, 1 second too long at a table that wasn't worth the effort. But Rachel didn't care. She had seen the boy's fingers curl tighter around his spoon, the tension in his shoulders loosen. That was reason enough. Evening had settled over Flagstaff with the quiet hush of freshly fallen snow. Inside Pinewood Grill, the rush of the day had ebbed away, leaving behind a few lingering customers and the low hum of fluorescent lights. The windows had fogged again from the contrast between the warm air and the freezing temperatures outside, and the once bustling diner now felt like a shell emptied of its noise. Rachel moved slowly through the dining area, her body aching from the hours she had been on her feet. Her shoes, soaked through at the toes from earlier snowmelt, squeaked slightly as she walked. She began the familiar routine of closing, collecting stray napkins, wiping down tables, restocking condiments. Jerry had left 2 hours ago, tossing her the keys on his way out with the usual muttered excuse about urgent errands. It wasn't the first time he had done that. Likely wouldn't be the last. As she cleared the table by the front window, the same one where the quiet boy and his father had sat, something caught her eye. Nestled between the salt shaker and the napkin holder was a single sheet of paper, folded once across the middle. Not a receipt, not a scrap. She picked it up carefully, unfolding it with her fingertips, still slightly sticky from syrup. It was a drawing, made with crayons or perhaps markers, the lines slightly shaky but full of intent. A woman stood beside a window, her figure unmistakable in an apron, hair pulled back in a familiar bun. Next to her stood a small boy, smiling broadly, a thin tube drawn across his chest and looping over his ears. Behind them, the outline of pine trees, the edge of the diner's table, the suggestion of winter light. Below the figures, in slightly crooked letters, one word had been printed in large, bold strokes. Thank you. Rachel stared at the image for a long moment. It was simple, childlike, and yet something about it struck her harder than the exhaustion she carried. She turned the paper over, no name, no note, just this quiet gesture left behind. A goodbye, a memory, a message. She folded it carefully and slid it into the pocket of her coat. The rest of the closing shift passed in silence. She stacked chairs onto tables, swept the floors, locked the register. The familiar click of the mop bucket rolling across tile echoed against the walls. Outside, streetlights cast long shadows over patches of untouched snow. She dumped the last bag of trash into the dumpster behind the building, her breath rising in thick clouds as she exhaled into the night air. Back at home, the apartment was dimly lit and still. Her mother had already turned in for the night, the door to her bedroom slightly ajar. A pill organizer rested on the counter, its compartments already emptied for the day. On the couch, her younger brother lay curled up under a fleece blanket, his work uniform crumpled on the nearby chair. The hum of the heater struggled to keep the cold at bay. Rachel slipped into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the worn table where unpaid bills and grocery lists competed for space. Her laptop sat closed beside a chipped ceramic mug filled with pens. Out of habit, she opened the screen, intending only to check her email before bed. She didn't expect anything important, but there it was. A message from a scholarship fund she hadn't heard from in years. Her name appeared in the subject line, and as she clicked it open, her heart began to race. It had been a long time since she'd last contacted them, before her father's accident, before she had dropped out of school. She had once been a recipient of a merit-based scholarship, a recognition of her potential, of everything she could have been. The message was brief but clear. Her student account was still technically active, and if she was willing to return to her studies, the foundation was open to discussing new terms, possibly even reinstatement under special circumstances. A contact name, a phone number, an open door she hadn't known was still standing. Rachel stared at the screen, her fingers frozen on the trackpad. For a long time, she didn't move. It felt like a message from a parallel life, a life she had shelved and buried beneath responsibility and exhaustion. Carefully, she closed the laptop, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. She sat for several minutes in the quiet kitchen, her hands wrapped around the cooling glass of water, the crayon drawing still folded in her coat pocket. For the first time in a long while, the night didn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning began like any other in the sleepy rhythm of the diner. The sun broke slowly over the snow-dusted roofs, casting long golden lines through the fogged windows of Pinewood Grill. Inside, Rachel moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, restocking sugars, checking the coffee pots, wiping down menus still damp from condensation. The air smelled faintly of bacon and burned toast, and the radio hummed low with country music that blended into the hum of the fluorescent lights. Outside, a black SUV pulled up and parked neatly by the front. It stood out among the older pickups and sedans normally found in the lot. On its side door gleamed the clean, unmistakable logo of Harding Developments, a local construction firm known for commercial real estate and citywide infrastructure projects. The sight of it would have gone unnoticed by most, but Rachel caught a glimpse through the window just as the driver's door opened. Matt stepped out, no longer the tired father in a weathered jacket, but a different man entirely. He wore a dark overcoat, tailored and heavy, and carried a slim leather folder under one arm. His stride was calm but direct, his shoulders set with purpose. There was no hesitation as he approached the entrance and pushed open the diner's door. The bell above the door gave its usual chime, but this time the sound carried further, drawing glances from both customers and staff. Rachel froze in mid-step, a coffee pot in hand, watching him as he scanned the room and moved with quiet authority toward the counter. He asked for the manager. Jerry, always smug in his authority, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. There was a confident scoff in his posture as he stepped forward, unbothered and unaware. What happened next was brief. From where Rachel stood, she couldn't hear the words, but the shift in tone was visible almost immediately. Jerry's grin tightened. His arms folded, then unfolded. The two men spoke for no more than 5 minutes. No voices were raised, no dramatic gestures made. But at the end of the exchange, Jerry snatched his coat from the peg near the break room door, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind him. Matt turned around, adjusted the folder under his arm, and walked calmly over to the table nearest Rachel. Without a word, he pulled a small card from his coat pocket and set it on the table. Then he nodded once in her direction and walked out just as quietly as he had arrived. Rachel hesitated before picking up the card. It was thick, smooth to the touch, embossed with gold lettering. The name printed at the center made her breath catch slightly. Matthew Harding, Chief Executive Officer, Harding Developments. Below the name was a direct phone number and the company's downtown address. For a moment she just stared at it, as though expecting it to vanish or transform into something more ordinary. But it remained in her hand, tangible and real. Later that same afternoon, just after the lunch rush had subsided, a woman in a gray blazer stepped through the diner's front door. She was accompanied by a man in a wool coat carrying a leather briefcase. They introduced themselves to the remaining staff and requested a quick staff meeting. Rachel joined the small circle of waitresses and kitchen workers by the counter, her heart already guessing what was coming. The man with the briefcase produced a stack of documents, clipped and labeled. The woman introduced herself as Karen Lewis, a regional manager with experience in hospitality leadership and employee relations. As of that moment, she was the new acting general manager of Pinewood Grill. Karen's voice was calm and steady, her tone firm but respectful. She outlined a plan for restructuring the diner's operations, including fair scheduling, proper training, and the implementation of a transparent tip-sharing system. The staff listened in silence, some surprised, others relieved. Rachel stood near the back, the business card still in her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against its corner every so often as if to remind herself it was real. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again in slow, deliberate flakes. Inside, for the first time in a long while, something felt different. Not finished, but beginning. A week passed in quiet transition. The diner adjusted to its new leadership with cautious optimism, routines shifting subtly under the guidance of Karen Lewis. Staff meetings began to include words like fairness, safety, and accountability. Rachel, though still working long hours, moved through her shifts with a different kind of energy, one not driven by fear or necessity alone, but by the faintest sense that change might be possible. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came in a plain envelope, addressed by hand, and slipped through the mail slot in the early afternoon. Rachel didn't notice it until she returned home later that evening, the scent of grilled onions and bleach still clinging to her uniform. The apartment was dim, lit only by the overhead kitchen bulb that flickered every now and then. She shrugged off her coat, kicked off her shoes, and nearly passed the envelope by until her name, carefully written in ink, caught her eye. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Inside was a single typed page, signed at the bottom in firm black pen. It was from Matthew Harding. The words were direct but thoughtful. He had watched her that day in the diner. Not just her actions, but her presence, her patience with his son, the way she moved through difficulty without complaint, the calm she maintained under pressure. He wrote of his own hardships, of losing his wife to cancer 2 years earlier, and the long, quiet struggle of raising a sick child alone. He hadn't come to the diner looking for anything, but what he saw had stayed with him. The letter went on to outline a program his company was quietly funding in collaboration with a local community college and nonprofit partners. It was designed for women like Rachel, women who had once pursued higher education but had been forced to abandon it due to caregiving responsibilities. The initiative offered full tuition, mentorship, and a monthly stipend. Participants could also gain part-time work experience within Harding Developments, specifically in the company's youth outreach department, which focused on educational programs for underserved children and teens. Rachel read the letter 3 times, each time more slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pages, not out of fear but disbelief. This wasn't a grant application or a vague suggestion. It was an offer, concrete, personal, and real. It was the kind of opportunity she had long ago trained herself to stop hoping for. The kitchen was silent except for the low ticking of the wall clock. On the table beside her lay the remnants of her life's routine. A nearly empty coffee mug, the medication schedule for her mother, a pile of past due bills held together with a rubber band, and her brother's work ledger scribbled in pencil. Every item spoke of responsibility, urgency, and survival. Now, among them, lay something else entirely. A letter offering not escape, but renewal. A path not backward, but forward. Rachel sat with it in her lap for over an hour, unmoving. Her mind raced with questions. How to balance the time, who would care for her mother during classes, what it would mean to step into an office again, to open books with purpose instead of nostalgia. But beneath those questions pulsed something stronger. The realization that someone had seen her, not just as a worker or caregiver, but as a person who still had something to give, something to build. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a wall. It looked like a door. A year had passed, marked not by grand events but by steady progress, quiet milestones and moments that accumulated like snowflakes, soft, persistent, and transformative. Rachel had become a student again. She now wore an ID badge instead of an apron, carried a clipboard rather than a server's notepad. Her days were spent in the field, completing her practicum at a local family support center that specialized in psychological services for parents and children with disabilities. She drove across town in a modest sedan with a cracked windshield and a heater that sometimes failed, visiting homes where resilience lived behind worn front doors. Her role was equal parts counselor, listener, and guide. She sat with parents who had forgotten how to speak about themselves. She played games with children who hadn't yet learned to trust new faces. In every home, she left a piece of herself, and in return, she carried their stories forward. One of her earliest and most familiar faces was Jason. He had become her quiet shadow, her reminder of how it all began. Once shy and withdrawn, he now attended a specialized school, where he spent more time laughing than watching the floor. He still used his breathing machine on tough days, but his world had grown bigger. Art became his language, and he shared it proudly. One afternoon, after a session, he handed her a folded piece of construction paper. Inside was a drawing, crayon lines and bold colors forming a simple image, a small house with 3 figures standing side by side, one tall, with a ball cap, one smaller, with brown hair and a machine drawn with innocent detail, and one with a bun and a wide smile. Beneath them, in large letters, he had written, "Home is where people understand you." Rachel had placed the drawing in a frame on her desk at the center. She looked at it often when the days felt heavy. Her mother now lived in a fully accessible apartment in a quiet complex, supported by a professional caregiver who visited daily. The arrangement gave them both peace. Her mother had safety and independence, and Rachel could breathe knowing help was always close. Her brother, after bouncing between jobs for years, had finally settled into a stable position at a regional mechanics shop, where he trained younger workers and finally talked about taking night classes himself. He had started seeing someone, a kind, practical woman who adored dogs and could fix a garbage disposal with one hand. Sundays became sacred. Each week, as the sun dipped below the pines and the cold rolled in early, they all gathered at Pinewood Grill. The diner had changed since Karen took over. New light fixtures, updated booths, warm colors on the walls. But it retained its heart. The jukebox still played old country hits, and the smell of grilled cheese and cinnamon coffee lingered like memory. Rachel would arrive with a small tray of pastries or a new children's book she'd found for Jason. Her mother would wheel in slowly, always wrapped in a shawl, her eyes bright with anticipation. Her brother and his girlfriend would take their usual corner booth, already arguing good-naturedly about which dessert to split. And Matt, quiet, steady Matt, would bring Jason, help him hang up his coat, and then sit with the calm presence of someone who had found peace in structure and routine. Some nights felt almost too good, too whole, as if the pieces had come together with uncanny precision. Rachel never said that out loud. She knew that life didn't hand out perfect endings, but she also knew this wasn't luck. This was the product of a choice, a single moment of instinctive kindness, a refusal to ignore need when it appeared quietly and uninvited at her table. And every time she passed that corner window, the one where Jason had once sat, tense and silent, looking out at a world he wasn't sure he could face, she would catch her reflection in the glass. Not in a uniform, not with a tray, not running between tables. She saw herself as she truly was, capable, compassionate, unshakably present, someone who hadn't walked away.